hit record. And I also wanted to make sure I talk shit about people before hitting record. So here we are. All right, letting more people in. So I'm going to turn to the attendance real quick. So as usual, I'm going to ask you to shout out your name in response once I say your name, or excuse me, to shout out that you're here once I call your name, just to let me know. So I'm going to turn to the attendance page real quick. All right, Jack.
Here.
Jack. Cool. Sadie.
Here.
Mina. Is Mina Cavazos here? Okay. Thea.
Here.
Nehemiah.
Here.
Joseph.
Here.
Okay. Destery.
Here.
Bennett.
Here.
Donald. Donnie. Is Donald here? Nope. Okay. Wyatt. Wyatt Goff. Okay. Justin. Justin Gray.
Here.
Tristan.
Here.
Sam. Is Sam Hennessy here? Joshua. Is Joshua here? Nope. Raven.
Here.
Ava.
Here.
I'm sorry. Is it Eva?
Yeah, Eva or Ava. I'll honestly respond to either one though. It's been a lot of both.
You prefer Eva, right?
Yeah, usually.
Okay, cool. Jackie.
Here.
Owen is here.
Hey.
Brianna.
Here.
Michaela.
Here.
Mac. I think I saw Mac here.
Yep.
All right. B. Is B Nelson here? Tyler. Okay. Kai. I think I saw. Yeah, Kai is here. Avery. Avery Paulson. Okay. Kayla Van Ruyen.
It's Kala here.
I was gonna check. So once again, I got it wrong. Kala, try to remember that. So Kala is here. Okay. James Walter. Is James here? Okay. Micah. Micah Waters. Okay, Megan.
I'm here.
And Ryan. Ryan Wingrove.
Here.
So let me just make sure there's no one. Oh, got a couple folks in the waiting room. Okay, Donnie and Micah are here, so let me adjust the attendance real quick for them. All right. So is there anyone whose name I missed? Is anyone present whose name I did not call? All right, cool. So we're going to get into our discussion of Plato, beginning with selections from the dialogues Ion, which is an early dialogue of Plato's, and the Symposium, a middle dialogue. And that kind of scholarly distinction between periods of literary output is pretty important when it comes to gaining a sense of what Plato is up to. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then really the focus of our discussion in terms of aesthetics is going to be, that is a theoretical approach to philosophical aesthetics, is going to be about the nature of poetic or poietic, drawing on the original Greek etymology, inspiration. So from where does this come? And this is going to put us in a position to also gain some clarity on aesthetic emotions, perhaps versus alternative emotional affects, that is everyday, ordinary expression. And really, we'll be talking about divine madness, right? Poetry or art as a kind of insanity. And so that will be tempered, that aspect of our engagement with the history of aesthetic concepts and ideas will be tempered a little bit on Thursday when we talk about, rather than inspiration, creative poiesis or divine madness, we'll be talking about measure, meter, and so forth in terms of imitation or mimesis. But before we get into that, because I wanted to, as I mentioned, and we didn't get a chance to last week, just look at some of the images of contemporary and early modern art when talking about Francisco Goya from Cynthia Freeland's chapter, Blood and Beauty, from her text, But Is It Art? So there are a few images I had set aside to look at that she mentions. And so we can maybe return our attention to the text a little bit. But before we do that, so I'll show us some images of some really famous works of art. Before we do that, though, are there any questions or concerns to address before we move on? So one thing I will say is there are still roughly 8 or 9 of you who need to find a group for the group presentation assignment. So if you have not yet signed up for a place in one of those groups, I encourage you to do so as soon as you can. So there are still several spots available for Thursday's discussion, which is the group 1 presentation to get us going on Plato. And there's some space available under Hegel as well. And so if you don't see a group, if not all of the groups are visible for you when you make this attempt, it's because the hidden groups have been filled up. So if it turns out there's no spot for you because they've all been filled up, well, just send me an email or I'll try to see if you're sort of hanging there and we can figure out where to put you. So to add you to an already existing group, I just have a limit set for each group in terms of membership to avoid having any lopsided groups, to ensure that they're more or less even. So are there any questions about that? So hopefully we can get all of the group assignments sorted out by today. So again, there is a presentation coming up and I want you guys to have adequate time to reach out to the other group members and prepare. But really what I have in mind for this is the group in question for the relevant day as scheduled will simply take ownership over the discussion, over how we address the materials for 10 to 20 minutes or so. And ideally, since this is a philosophy of art class, as in addition to what you might want to contribute or focus on in terms of the readings, I encourage every one of you to seek out examples of works of art of any kind of genre or medium to bring to help more concretely or in greater detail focus our conversations and discussion for that week. So if you're confused about what to do in terms of presenting, a good place to start is to try to find some examples from the art world that would be relevant to or help to bear out some of the ideas that we're seeing these philosophers articulate or grapple with. So are there any questions about any of that? So I'll take a look at the enrollments for those group assignments later today, and I'll send out, if I need to, a reminder via email to you guys. Okay. So I just wanted to pull up some images now. One at a time, of course. So this is a famous photograph that Cynthia Freeland mentions in the article. And it's by the artist Andre Serrano. And the title of this is what? Anyone know?
Is it Piss Christ?
Right, exactly. Yeah, so Eva, you might remember this. We talked about this painting in particular in the existentialism course in the winter. So what is the reason that Cynthia Freeland spends some time discussing this in conversation with some other art critics and the art world more broadly? But what is the relevance to Piss Christ? And as a work of art, what exactly is this? So in terms of the artwork itself as an object, what is it that we're seeing here? What is the work?
I'm pretty sure it's just like a little, I don't even know if it's an expensive figurine cross with Jesus, just submerged in piss.
I believe it's like plastic, like it's a very
Cheap.
like gift shop crucifix
Yeah,
sort of thing.
good. So we're dealing with a wooden and plastic crucifix that's inexpensive and easily attainable, mass produced, right? And let's say some kind of vitrine or vat of urine. So those are the materials or the components that make up the work in part, but what is the actual work? So if you were to enter, say, a gallery or a museum space where this is presented, what is the object that you would perceive and relate to?
A photograph.
Mm-hmm. So it's a photograph of extremely high, clear resolution and a high gloss, reflective surface, which, as described in the chapter, makes it extremely susceptible to corruption and to damage of some kind. And it's also very large. So I can't remember the precise dimensions, but it's some like 40 feet or something. It's a really impressively sized photograph. And so I want to talk about this for a couple of reasons, just to gain a clearer understanding of what contemporary, that is, late modern artists are up to qua artists, that is, in the capacity of artists. And so we can use this conversation, this aspect of it, to tease out some important insights about aesthetic theory. So what art is in general. So we have a sensuous medium, photography. It's sensuous in that it's available for our sensuous engagement on the part of our five senses. It's visual. And as visual, it's a visual representation. And so that's what photographs are. So something is being represented, and thus we might understand what's going on here in terms of mimetic theory. So mimesis, as we'll see especially next week, is the Greek for imitation. So photography as such, as an artistic medium, is eminently mimetic. It is to represent in some way an object typically available for ordinary human sensory experience, right? And so just, however, on the basis of immediate visual intuition, you see, as described, a crucifix. But it's not immediately, that is, obviously, readily apparent what the liquid or crystalline substance is in which the crucifix is suspended. And so if you weren't aware already of the title Piss Christ, which is obviously deliberately provocative on the part of the artist, it would be mysterious precisely where it is that this crucifix is and in what material it's suspended. So what is the background of presentation or illumination through which this is being depicted? It's indeterminate. You can't really tell, but the title gives it away, right? So that tells us something interesting about the relationship between a name or a title and a particular work of art. So your experience as an observer or a consumer would be radically different depending upon epistemically what is given or available to you. That is what you know about the work. So if you know the title, Piss Christ, then you seem to know something about its origin. So that tells you something about the liquid or crystalline sort of fluid in which you find the main object presented. And it also tells you something maybe about the artist's intentions. So he's deliberately being inflammatory or provocative. And so this shows us one area of tremendous controversy. This has been incredibly debated from a number of points of view. But what does Cynthia Freeland in her conversation in presenting this controversy, this dilemma in the chapter in conversation with the art critic Lippard, what does she say about this? So what does Serrano himself as the artist say about this? So what are his intentions? Is he being unholy? Is he trying to, through an aesthetic representation, undermine the authority of, say, the Catholic Church, or repudiate an individual's faith or something like that? And that's certainly something that critics have commented in terms of with respect to how to take up and discuss and place this kind of work. But what is Serrano's own position on this?
Freeland sort of outlines how it could be a denunciation of like institutional religion as opposed to, personal spiritual beliefs, which sort of seems like it makes sense to me. I mean, like if you just look at the appearance, it looks beautiful. When I first saw this back in the existentialism class, I thought it was like a hyper detailed painting of Jesus on the cross in like a bloody red sunset. And then I heard the title and I was like, oh, that's not what it is at all. That's kind of ridiculous. But I suppose, Serrano could be saying the same about institutional religion. Like you look at people who are, and this is not to condemn anybody who's a part of an institutionalized religion or anything, of course, but if you look at the way that, a lot of major churches are structured and everything, there's this very high gloss, attractive appearance. And then behind that, there's sort of a lack of spiritual depth. It seems almost superficial and tainted in some way.
Good, yeah. So yeah, I really appreciate those comments. So Serrano, remember, identifies as a devout Catholic himself. And so from a particular theological orientation in connection to these Abrahamic religions, so of which Christianity is one representative, there has been a role for perceiving something sacred or perhaps even sublime in our ordinary refuse, that is repugnant biological materials. So you might say there is a history of scatological meaning to be derived from seemingly profane entities. So that is to say there is something spiritual to blood, something spiritual to urine in this case, which is often ignored because of our ordinary habits of disgust or our orientation, a kind of pre-reflective orientation to certain materials or aspects of our experience as taboo. But Serrano is attempting to effect a reorientation to these materials such that we can see urine in a radically different light, as it were, as perhaps a source of beauty that makes a mysterious contact with the order of the divine, that is, with the sacred. But that's not obvious, right? That requires conversation. That requires coming to terms with an immediate reaction of critique or disgust or something like that. And so this is precisely a complex dynamic of experience that a work of art such as this can bring about. And it also plays with spatial dimensions in a provocative sense. So we're dealing with, as we mentioned, as described, a more or less unremarkable crucifix, mass-produced, made up of plastic and perhaps wood to a less extent, that you could acquire anywhere for free. So something very small, for example, yet its size, the power of its presence is because of what photography as a medium makes possible is indeterminate. You don't know how big this is. So it could be large enough to consume your entire perceptual space, what you perceive. It could be looming over you with the kind of imposing magnificence or authority. And that's exactly what the large emblazoned photograph situated in a museum space or a gallery space would make possible or would manifest in terms of you relating to it, walking into one of those spaces. Right. So really from this conversation, we can pull out a number of things. That the artist's intention is important, but it's not everything, right? So a lot of what we take from our encounter with this work of art happens at the level of immediate intuition, regardless of what we know about the artist's background or experience. But it also tells us that that immediate intuition can be transformed to a large extent on the basis of new knowledge when we acquire facts about the artist's motivations and background, right? And it also puts us in a place to recognize the role of naming, of titles in works of art that can do some surprising things. So does that make sense? Are there any comments or questions about this work or about Cynthia Freeland's discussion of it in the chapter?
I just Googled a picture of it because I wanted to see it sort of in context of a museum. And apparently when it was displayed in France, somebody broke into the gallery and took a hammer and broke the glass and destroyed part of the painting.
Oh, wow. Yeah, but one thing about photography is it's more or less easily reproducible.
Photograph, yeah, that's right.
But that tells you something interesting about the medium. So Walter Benjamin is a 20th century German Jewish philosopher whose piece on mimesis I made available as optional reading for next week. It's a couple pages, but he has a really famous essay called The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, where he talks about how in the 20th century, mechanically or technologically reproducible works of art, such as photographs or films or recorded music, things of that nature, bring about a surprising transformation of aesthetic possibility beyond ease of access or pervasive presence of these works and their reproducible status. And so that's very interesting to think about. So if you're interested in questions like that, I can, let you know where to find that essay. Okay, so another work to look at though, and this is because I'm showing this and Freeland mentions it in part because Serrano references the artist himself in defense of his own practice, his own intention. So I'm thinking of the 17th century famous Spanish painter Goya. And so this is the depiction of Saturn devouring his child. So Saturn is the Latinized version of the Greek god Kronos, who was a Titan god, so a precursor to the Olympians, such as Zeus, Athena, Apollo, and so forth. And Kronos feared that there was an insurrection on the part of his children, and so he set about eating them to ensure that they wouldn't overthrow him as he had overthrown his own father, the sky, Uranus, through the complicit direction of Earth, Gaia. So now Gaia worked with Zeus to prevent all of the offspring of Kronos to be defeated or eaten, I should say. And from that support, Zeus was able to overcome Kronos. But here, Goya is graphically depicting this. So we get the image of a god consuming a small person, in this case, the god's child. But there's nothing readily divine in character, I think, about any properties of this image. It's rather shocking and disturbing. So another reason to recommend showing this kind of image in a context such as today's session is to just point out that so-called shock art, like some critics used as that terminology to disparage Serrano, is nothing new. Right? Artists have been shocking viewers and audiences for millennia at this point. So it's not a problem if you're rather conservative, for example, for consumers of contemporary or modern art in particular. This is rather an issue that has been entangled with the history of aesthetic concepts and discourse, arguably from the very beginning. And that motivates, to some extent, too, Plato's own criticism of artists and poets in particular, to the extent that they want to imitate corrupt states of affairs or imperfect objects, which is, in other words, an effort to bring about falsehood rather than truth. And so that's just something to keep in mind in terms of how this tradition of approaching art by way of the concept of imitation or mimesis gets going, largely under the direction of Aristotle. Right? So this would have been shocking. And again, Serrano mentions this kind of affinity that he feels with the Spanish painter Goya in terms of his own drive as an artist, what grips him, what interests him, what he's up to in the way of visual representation. So any comments or questions about this one? I'm sure many of you, or perhaps at least some of you, were previously familiar with Goya, perhaps not this painting, but he's considered among the most talented and celebrated visual artists of the 18th century, early 19th century. So he was a contemporary of, as Freeland mentions, Kant and Hume, for example. Okay. So now the last image I want to show, this is one that she references too. So this is Damien Hurst's piece. And one reason to recommend talking about this in our particular context for this class has to do with the relationship between naming or titles and the work itself. So here we have a giant shark, a dead shark that has been suspended in some indeterminate fluid in a vitrine. And does anyone remember, what is the name of this piece?
I can't remember verbatim, but it's like the impossibility of death in the like eyes of a living thing or something like that.
Yeah, you're close. Yeah, it's the physical impossibility of death in the minds of the living. So what do you guys think about that in terms of what we see here as the work in question? So what is the relationship between this work of art and the title that Hurst elected to give it? Does anyone have thoughts about that?
The subject is very much frozen in a moment that seems very much alive. Like if I had no knowledge of sharks or life and death, like I might even think this was a photograph of a living shark or something. Or sorry, if I had no knowledge of this piece, I would think it might have been like a captured photograph of a living shark. But
In a cruelly constrained tank, right?
mhm. Oh yeah.
That would be far too small for the shark to be able to move about. Um, yeah, so perceiving this as a visual observer, it appears, and there's some trickery involved with the physical manipulation of the materials, in this case, an organic body. You might suspect that you're seeing a living organic body, right? So, just in terms of your visual awareness of what's going on, of the phenomenon of what presents itself for experience, it looks very much like death. Um, and so that's a good point. Or excuse me, it looks very much like it's alive. So then there's a kind of irony, perhaps, built into the title. Um, any other thoughts on that?
I think we kind of have this whole idea on like, I guess it involves like museums. Like, we go to museums all the time and see all these different exhibits, lifelike exhibits, but you know, a lot of the times they're just kind of fabricated to look real. So if we're actually presented with something that is real, then we almost kind of assume that it isn't, because we've already seen so much unreal. And because we're so around this whole idea of like looking around museums, seeing the past for what it was, and seeing creatures that are dead, like if we look at, you know, like evolutionary, you know, like skeletons or molds of what we used to be, we almost don't believe it to be real, just because it's kind of almost this fantasy. It's hard for us to put in this idea that this is something that once was, even though it's right in front of us.
Yeah, so we were talking about the effect of removing an entity or an object from its natural space, um, in terms of perhaps producing or translating an object into a work. And so I think, yeah, you're speaking to some extent about that here. This was an animal that navigated the oceans and carried out shark-like activities as a shark, but here we see it suspended in time, literally frozen. Um, and we're dealing with a shark. I mean, for that sense or meaning, we could really have any kind of previously living entity suspended, but there's something about sharks, right? And so I'm seeing the chat here. Sophia's, yeah, so she said that humans have a fascination for preservation. So yeah, I think that that's important too. And eyes seem resistant to death. Yeah, so we're perceiving through our eyes a dead entity here, and maybe that has the effect, and I believe this is to some extent what Hurst has in mind, on creating a reflective kind of return to the very possibility that undergirds our existence as the possibility of our own death. That is the possibility of it being impossible for us to any longer perceive anything. So, and that connects to what Donnie said too. So the shark represents death itself. And the case is our compartmentalization of the fear of dying that we think will hold the shark back, right? Yeah, excellent. That's a really great analysis, Donnie.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, isn't it the thing that sharks cannot stop or else they die, like with swimming with their gills? To be able to breathe, they need to keep moving, which is the same thing with our brains. I see death as just our brains shutting off at the moment, at a single moment, and we don't get to like make any more electrical pulses. And so it's like the same thing with the shark just stopping. We can't really imagine all of our pulses just stopping, just like a shark can't just stop.
Good, good, cool. I don't know about that in terms of shark biology, but maybe someone else does. But that's really interesting.
Most sharks have this limitation, but I don't think all of them do. Um, that said, there are like internal things that have to keep moving for life to go on. So I think that's a really excellent point.
Yeah, life is motion, matter in motion, like Owen said in the chat. And so, yeah, to build on that and what Donnie was saying too in the chat earlier, I mean, what is death? Death is the ultimate horizon for human experience beyond which we can say nothing. And so, trying to imagine death is trying to imagine nothing. But consciousness in which we are carrying out the effort of imagining is always consciousness of something in particular, right? So I try to think of my own death, the inevitability of my no longer being in the world, but the moment I do that, I turn it into something. So it's really impossible for me as a living being to come to grips with my own condition of unliving. The moment I think of it, I have somehow appropriated it as a content, even if that content is of death, is of non-being. I have somehow appropriated it into the conceptual structure of being. And therefore, in our case, as living sentient entities, the conceptual structure of life, right? Does that make sense? So it's impossible for us to think beyond the final horizon of our own consciousness. Yet we seemed, and this is what I mentioned earlier as the ultimate paradox of thought last week, this desire of thinking to think what cannot be thought. And so that's why many of us perhaps have an obsessive sort of relation to the possibility of our own dying. Whether that is nihilistic and despairing or curious or whatever else. And then, yeah, Kai mentioned, what is grief if not love persevering? Did you want to say
I stole that quote from WandaVision.
From who?
WandaVision. It's a Marvel show.
Oh, okay.
It's a really great show, by the way.
Okay. Yeah, I might have to check it out. All right, so this has been a really good conversation on these pieces, and those were all I wanted to show. But are there any final comments or questions about any of this?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up how apt the animal in question is as a predator and as a pop culture symbol of just like cruel, uncaring violence. It like the shark being frozen sort of invites us to consider that horizon being like tantalizingly close to us, but in a safe way.
Right.
Like it invites me and like I don't know about y'all, but to think like what would happen if the shark just came to life. When the horizon like you've been like walking towards your whole life in vain just sort of shrinks and gets right in your face. Like that's the moment that I keep seeing when I look at this box.
Yeah, and we're dealing with a three-dimensional object here, unlike Serrano's photograph. So if you were to encounter this in a museum space, you could, as a consumer, walk around it, perceive it from various angles. And if you were to stand directly in front of its face, you would literally be staring death in the face, because that's precisely what that kind of encounter would mean for you as a swimmer in the ocean, in the shark's house, as it were. So you stare death in the face, and this might have the effect, as Owen was suggesting, of turning that thematization back on you and putting you in a position of relative security to reflect on what that horizon indicates, what it amounts to, how you can relate to it as an existing individual. That is the horizon of your own surpassing, your own termination in the end. And that's something that art can make possible in this context, in a kind of concrete and really impactful lived immediacy. Whereas we can engage in all kinds of religious, theological, philosophical reflections about the nature of death and human finitude that will never really get you to the point of a visceral feeling or sense, such as you can find in encountering an aesthetic object like this in an art world context. So does that make some sense?
Oh yeah, and I wonder what the interpretation might be, or how it might change if the animal were different, like if it were a dolphin, or even something more mundane like a dog or something.
Yeah, so
Same title, just like different animal.
that's true. It would. So this is another example of how the title can alter your experience, or can contribute to or influence your experience in a variety of ways, which makes it very interesting. So you could actually, so you said same title, you might have a different animal, or Hurst could have elected to attach an entirely different title to this, which might have the result of bringing out different threads or different components of it that weren't in play before, or that you didn't really notice before. Okay, so any last comments or remarks on that stuff, questions?
Can I really quickly go off what Owen was saying about it being like a different animal or different title? I feel like it's as simple as, like, even if you keep the same animal and the same title, like the position that it's in, we talked about at the very beginning, being a very alive kind of position. And like, what if you could just change that, you know? Like make it look like a dead shark, I don't know, you know? So I feel like that completely then changes.
Yeah, like a
meaning.
hunter's trophy, right? So we've all seen heads of animals, whether in a real space or represented imagistically, which puts you as the viewer in a strange spot. You might be deeply disturbed or uncomfortable, or if you're an avid hunter or something, it might reflect your values in a really positive way. And the same could happen in terms of works of art, sort of playing with the assumptions that are in operation when any given individual is engaging with aesthetic phenomena, that is, phenomena that appear and that demand some kind of sensuous relating to them or comportment to them. So works of art in particular can disrupt or at least play with those assumptions or beginning conditions. Cool. Yeah, oriented upside down or something. That would be really interesting, I think. Okay, so we will take a break in just a few minutes, but it's 2:17 now. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started. So in about 10 or 12 minutes or so, where there's a natural break in the discussion, we'll take a break, 5 minutes or so. But I'm going to pull up my slides. So I will be modifying. I mean, I've already put these slideshows together for each of the readings. And I understand these slideshows in terms of the detail I contribute to them to be reading guides. So if you're confused about something in the text, you can go back to it. I'm going to engage various quotations, moments, and arguments that occur in these texts. So in that folder to which I linked you guys for access for all of these lecture slides, I've eliminated all of them because each week I'm going to anew put them in after I make a few changes. So I just added this one this morning. So right as of now, the only slideshow that will be in that shared drive or folder is this one. Okay. So this is a bust of Plato. And we'll get started with just a little bit of historical background in terms of who Plato was. So here's an illustration. It's very difficult to figure out what the historical figure looked like. As you can see, there are pretty wide differences in terms of representations. But this is the period in which Plato lived. So BCE is before the Common Era. It's usually presented as BC in contrast to AD, but we'll be using BCE, before the Common Era, versus CE, Common Era, at which point the timeline changes. So Plato, like his mentor Socrates, lived and died in Athens. As a devout Athenian, he was the founder of the so-called academy, which is the very first university. And it's the source of words like academic, academics, academia, and so forth. So along with Socrates and Aristotle, whom we'll turn to next week, Plato makes up what's called the classical Hellenic period of ancient philosophy. And so before that period was the so-called pre-Socratic period, made up of thinkers like Heraclitus, Parmenides, Pythagoras, whom some of you I'm sure have heard of because of the Pythagorean theorem, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Thales. So these were all so-called pre-Socratic thinkers, which means that something of decisive significance gets introduced to the philosophical landscape in the practice of Socrates. And what we really find there is a more dedicated and sustained attunement towards human matters, the good, the just, the beautiful, the right, the wrong, rather than Socrates' predecessors, whom like Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Thales, and so forth, were more concerned with so-called natural philosophical questions that we would perhaps more readily associate with disciplines like physics and biology now. But these disciplines emerged, of course, out of philosophy, and it wasn't until roughly the 18th, 19th century that the term science and natural science, scientist, even came about in distinction to philosophers or natural philosophers. So Plato is considered by many to be the most, absolutely the most influential philosopher in history, who has profoundly shaped our world in terms of science, history itself as a discipline, art, biology, politics, and so forth. And so Alfred North Whitehead, an important British thinker who had lived in the United States for a period of the 20th century, famously said that all of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato, which means that every question and problem that we can see contemporary philosophers engaged with is available in some form in the Platonic dialogues, right? And so that's a really significant aspect of all of this to understand. And so in terms of Plato's most famous, his lasting, most notable philosophical contribution in terms of some kind of doctrine, it would be his so-called theory of the forms. And we'll talk to some extent about this theory. And it's given expression in a variety of famous dialogical contexts in Plato's work, in particular, the Euthyphro, an early dialogue, it comes up there. The Republic, most famously, it has a place in the so-called Allegory of the Cave, for those of you who are familiar with that. The dialogue Symposium, it really shows up there in a strong way, albeit to some extent implicitly. And then also the Phaedo, which is the dialogue in which we find Socrates in prison, speaking with his friends, at the end of which he drinks the poison, the hemlock, and dies. And so we will be talking about this theory of the forms. But I'm curious, and I know some of you are because you've taken courses with me before, but is anyone who hasn't taken a philosophy class with me before, is anyone familiar with Plato's theory of the forms? At least in a simplified or superficial way? Anybody? No? Well, maybe.
Didn't you say something about the allegory of the cave?
Mhm.
That's the only thing that I can really remember learning about. So the theory of forms, can you like describe that again?
Sure. So maybe someone, does someone want to jump in and help and explain the theory of the forms in the context of that allegory, that story?
I can certainly give it a shot.
Go ahead.
And especially in relation to the allegory of the cave, which you're familiar with. It poses that all of the things that we see in this world are sort of shadows on like our like three-dimensional wall from a higher realm of some sort, in which like true and perfect examples of all that we see exist. And for our purposes right now, like beauty is a big one.
Mhm.
There is somewhere out there the concept of beauty as a form, or perhaps even as like a conscious agent or something that we can't know or even perceive directly, but we can know and perceive indirectly through things that we consider to be beautiful.
Good, perfect. So what's an example of something that we might consider beautiful?
Plato.
Well, he was much more handsome than Socrates, that's for sure. But well, I'm seeing some beautiful birds right now, enjoying some seeds in the bird feeder. I see some beautiful flowers over there. So right now, I've just given you two examples of phenomena or objects that we characteristically understand to be beautiful or exemplary of the beautiful. Yet, what is it really that brings these purple flowers into conformity with these birds that I see enjoying seeds right now? I mean, flowers and birds are pretty remarkably different beings. Yet I'm claiming, without making any argument, just describing my experience, I'm claiming that they are flower and bird identical. They are the same in terms of their participation or expression or manifestation of beauty or of the beautiful. So Plato would say, leveraging this theory of the forms, that both the birds I just saw and are now gone, and the flowers that I recognized as beautiful are beautiful to the extent that they participate in the unchanging eternal form of beauty, but which neither of which exhaust. So they are getting closer to in their being. They are approximating the perfect form of the beautiful, but always falling short insofar as, unlike the form of beauty itself, these entities, whether the flowers or the birds, are temporal. So they came into being at some time, they will change and eventually disappear from being. Whereas beauty as such, in order for it to serve as a measure, as a standard, must be unchanging. And so we might, as subjects, as different individuals with different interests and backgrounds, provide different examples of what we understand beauty to be. Yet, however different those instances might be, we nevertheless know what each other is saying. We understand what we mean when I say this bird is beautiful, or you tell me this math problem is beautiful, or this piece of music is beautiful, or if this athletic play on the soccer field is beautiful, or something like that. So does that make some sense in terms of this theory? We'll dig into it more deeply.
Yeah, that makes a little more sense.
Okay. Yeah, so Owen said in the chat, beauty remains just as present in the flowers even after the birds have gone away. Right. So the phenomena of a sensuous nature that I can experience through my senses is always given to profound or subtle change. So nothing sensory remains the same. Yet the basis of our rendering such phenomena and experiences as intelligible, so my ability to say this is beautiful or this is an example of the beautiful, presupposes that I have some intellectual or conceptual grasp of the form of beauty. which I'm able to perceive in a sensuous way when an object is immediately before me.
So I have a question then. I wrote this down from the reading just because I wanted to like go back and revisit it, but said something about sense deals with concrete particulars rather than with abstract universals. Is that kind of like what you're talking about here?
Good, yeah. So the flower I mentioned or the bird that I'm describing as beautiful are concrete particulars. Yet I'm able to recognize each, and they're quite different, a bird and a flower. I'm able to recognize them both as the same as beautiful, sharing in the status of beautiful, because I am able to intelligibly apprehend or grasp the presence, the operative presence of the concept of beauty at work in these physical entities, the bird and the flower. So I grasp their immediate presence with my eyes, and it's because my mind, before I even see these entities, my mind was already familiar with the very concept of beauty. Before I saw anything with my eyes, because my mind was already familiar with it, I am able to recognize the bird and the flower as exemplary of, that is, as examples of the beautiful. Whereas Plato argues that if we didn't have this prior sense, an intellectual understanding of what a concept like the beautiful or the good or the just are, for example, then we could never recognize legitimate instances in our experience as legitimate instances, that is, as examples. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's take, it's actually starting to get windy and rain a little bit out here. So let's take a break now. I'll stop sharing. So let's meet back here at 2:36. It says 2:31 on my clock. So I'm actually gonna move inside, I think. So I'll see you guys in about 5 minutes or so. So I'm going to pause the. Okay, I see a couple of you are back. Okay. So before I jump back into the slides, does anyone have kind of general questions or any comments you'd like to make about the readings, either the Ion or the Symposium at this point? Is there anything that stood out to you as interesting or something confusing that you might have questions about?
So something that I thought was interesting, that he said something about looking at something without art or knowledge and just being inspired by it. So does that basically mean that you can be really moved by something, but if you don't actually understand like the complexity behind it, it's just like not like observing it the correct way?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so we'll spend a lot of time on that issue in Plato. And this, as an issue, sets the stage for further debates in the area of aesthetics in not only Aristotle, but the entire subsequent history of that. And it's really a confrontation, as we'll see, between art as techne, which is a kind of technical knowledge, and art as inspiration or a kind of chaotic madness. There seems to be a tension, even in the case of Plato's own philosophical considerations of art, such that he finds the source of what we now take to be art in inspiration or unaccountable poetic madness to be not all that good necessarily. It's potentially destructive, dangerous, and threatening. But there's also something, as you can see in the Ion especially, but also the Symposium, to say that a poet who is not out of his or her mind is in some way less competent, less effective as a poet. So there's a kind of, not paradox necessarily, but there's a kind of unworked out tension or difficulty in Plato's thought that gets preserved in all of these discussions to follow. And so we'll spend some time on that. So it's a definitional tension in terms of how we're to understand what art is, between art as systematic, art as a technical skill and source of knowledge and place for the application of this kind of knowledge, and then art as somehow chaotic, as dangerous, as coming from a place of excess, of self-surpassing or overwhelmingness. And this seems to be a tension that one side of which is privileged or given greater focus or consideration depending upon the philosopher and the period under question, right? So yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned that. Any other, so we will talk about that in some detail. Any other comments or questions?
I think going off of that, and then this isn't a question, it's just something I kept coming back to while reading, is that there's a heavy spiritual element to this dialogue, specifically the ion dialogue. I mean, it applies to both, but strictly in relation to the last class, or we had like a post breakout room discussion, there's a lot of focus on like the relativistic personal interpretation of art, and less so on like metaphysical forms or like the place of divinity and inspiration in art. And so I felt that it was just a very new idea to me, a new way to focus on it.
Okay, yeah. So interpretation. So I mentioned these areas of focus or possible elements of consideration that arise in these readings, in particular for this week and next week, of art as technical knowledge, art as divine inspiration, art as a longing for beauty. But then there's also the role of interpretation, and the very basic kind of relationship that we enjoy as finite mortals with the realm of the divine is an interpretive relation. And so that's another angle from which to see how this area of human practice and life came about in our history that we call art. Trying to grapple with our finitude, that is to say, the inevitability again of our own death, and for that reason, a kind of imperfection in terms of our relationship to the cosmos, to the universe as a whole, but we still are driven by the desire to make sense of that whole, of that totality of which we are an imperfect and only partial part. And so that's what motivates the necessity for interpretation, right? And there's interpretation that goes on the part of the creator, on the part of the artist. Then there's interpretation that goes on the part of something like an actor or a rhapsode, a performer. So a performer of already composed music or something. There's an interpretation there too, or a theatrical rendition of, say, a Shakespearean tragedy. There's the interpretation that the director of the production will have to make, an interpretation that the costume designers will have to make, an interpretation that the members of the audience who are perceiving the spectacle will have to make. And so there are different levels of this dynamic of interpretation that we'll turn to. Okay, so, oh yeah, so I'm just checking the chat. Owen mentioned the chair example, which I usually use when making sense of Plato's theory of the forms. So I'm sitting in a chair right now, and if I were to walk into this room for the first time, upon seeing it, without any effort, I would recognize it as a chair. And that means I have some prior familiarity with let's say, the concept of a chair, such that I know what any particular entity that counts as a chair has to exemplify, has to demonstrate in terms of its being. Yet, at the same time, even though I have this simple ability for recognition, I implicitly know that there is a virtual infinity of new chairs that have not yet been created that I could conceive of, perhaps, or not conceive of, and that I might be surprised about when I see it, but I would still be able to say that's a chair. And for that to be possible, I have to have some prior intellectual relating to the very universal form of chairness that allows me to perceive adequate examples of chairness, but still be open to new instances of what a chair can be that have not yet been available for my experience. So hopefully that example helps to make a little bit more sense. 2, so that means the very form of chairness as an idea, let's say, although that's potentially misleading because for Plato, these forms are not just ideas in minds or different consciousnesses. They exist more really somewhere out there, which commentators refer to as Plato's heaven. They exist really in a way that surpasses even the reality of the temporal existence that is the sensible particulars that I can sit in like I am now. That is to say, the form of chairness exceeds in reality even this individual physical chair. And so this is the basis of Platonic metaphysics, which discriminates between the world of the universal forms and the world of the sensible particulars. And the world of the sensible particulars, which make up the world of our ordinary lived experience, is dependent on the world of the forms. So there's a kind of causal relationship too, such that this chair that I'm actually sitting in at this moment could only be created because the person who made the chair had some idea of what the final product would look like. And then went about putting to work the various elements to create the chair that I recognize. And so that means the formal conception of chairness exists before the possibility of any physical realization of that conception in our shared space. Okay, so are there any questions about that? So hopefully that'll help as we continue with Plato here. So I'll jump back into the slides. Okay. So let's take a look at the ion. We'll spend more time on the symposium, and we might have to carry this conversation over a little bit next time at the beginning of class. So the ion is considered among Plato's earliest dialogues, and it's possible that he composed this while Socrates was still living. So it's one of the very earliest dialogues, and there's been a little bit of controversy as to whether Plato actually wrote this, but the general scholarly consensus now is that he must have, is that he did. So like all dialogues from Plato, early, middle, or late, the ion focuses on one particular question or theme. And in the focus or emphasis on this theme, invariably other such themes or questions are introduced. And so what is the essential theme of the ion? Well, it's the nature of poetic or creative inspiration. And what is the question of the ion? Is poetry most essentially the product of technical expertise or a kind of divine madness? And this sets up the contours of that debate, of that controversy that I mentioned a little while ago in terms of how to understand the essence, the heart of this endeavor that we call art or label with the aesthetic. So that's the question. Is, first of all, art essentially poetic? And then what is it that demarcates the poetic most centrally from that which is otherwise? Is it technical knowledge, or is it a kind of possession that is a kind of divine madness? And the answer is never clearly decided by Plato. So it remains open. But this is some important Greek vocabulary to know. And this gets to the heart of this dichotomy, of this tension, specifically on the side of technical expertise. So on page 53, where Socrates says, no one can fail to see, just to back up a little bit, what is Ion, as the character in this dialogue, asking Socrates? So what does he want to know at the beginning?
So he's very passionate about Homer and the poems and the epic that Homer has gifted to the generation he's a part of. But there are other poets, and he doesn't like have the same passion about them, even though like he sort of expects to. And Socrates goes on to tell him why.
Good. Yeah, so Ion is what we call a rhapsode, and that's pretty much an actor. So the rhapsode plays the role of what an actor would do now in terms of theatrical narratives or films. And so a rhapsode like Ion would carry out in a public venue for an audience various scenes from Homeric epics, or perhaps other such poetic scenes. But when disposed in the status or the role of actor or rhapsode to carry out the works of these other poets, Ion finds himself frozen, right? He finds himself asleep, as he said. He's not able to participate. He can't really represent these scenes very well. He can't speak effectively or intelligently about the content of other poetic visions, non-Homeric poetic visions. So he wants Socrates as a philosopher to help account for this strangeness. And so the answer Socrates gives at first is, no one can fail to see that you speak of Homer without any art or knowledge. If you were able to speak of him by rules of art, you would have been able to speak of all other poets, for poetry is a whole. That is, poetry as a discipline, or in other words, poetry as an art is a whole. So all arts, all individual arts, as possible loci of technical competence and expertise, are of a whole, right? So the art of painting, as an example he gives, is of a whole. That is, there are norms involved in painting. There are right ways and wrong ways to go about a pictorial representation, which one can learn, for example, in art school. When it comes to making shoes, there are norms involved there as well as to technical efficacy. So there's a right way and a wrong way to go about building shoes. So the word used here for art, so what gets translated from the Greek to art, is techne. So techne, along with other concepts, similar concepts, represents a particular kind of knowledge for the Greek. And as a kind of knowledge, it's to be demarcated from, say, episteme, which is something that we would call scientific knowledge, and also Sophia, which is something like full-fledged or robust philosophical wisdom that one can develop over a lifetime of engaging in episteme, or scientific questions. And so there are other modes of knowledge too to talk about. So art is translated from the Greek techne, meaning something like technical or productive knowledge. So doctors possess medical techne, carpenters possess house building techne, lawyers and public speakers possess rhetorical techne, the art of rhetoric or persuasion. Chefs or cooks possess food making techne, Generals possess war-making techne, and so on. So then there would be a relevant techne or order of technical knowledge with respect to poetry, the idea goes here. So what is it that all of these so-called arts have in common? Well, they're a kind of expert knowledge. And what do we mean by expert knowledge? We mean knowledge that you can't simply acquire, at least not in the same way, through lived experience, right? So of course, you can have access to folk remedies or something like that, or like homeopathic medicine or something. So you might know from experience that if you're feeling ill, if you have a stomach ache, if you drink like chamomile tea or something like that, it will have the effect of relieving your suffering. You don't have to be a doctor for that. You can come to that knowledge through experience. Yet, you might, before drinking chamomile, drink some kind of really strong black tea, and that would, you'd find, hurt your stomach even more. So through trial and error, you come to something that actually helps. A doctor is someone who goes through a kind of educational system that learns from other experts to cut short this kind of progress by trial and error, right? So then when you learn to become a doctor, you internalize certain principles. That is, you come to know certain effects as having resulted from prior causes, certain causes, so that you have knowledge of what causes as necessary conditions or strategies as a physician have to be in place to achieve a certain salutary effect when you're trying to cure a sickness or an illness. And so you can also go to school to become a carpenter, where you will learn from previous experts the principles, the rules of the craft involved in building houses. Whereas, of course, any jackass could pick up some wood and a hammer and some nails and give you a hovel, which may or may not last the week. But if you have knowledge, that is techne, well, you have the effect of producing a good result without this protracted process of trial and error. But also importantly, you have developed in your own way your knowledge as a matter of systematic expertise within this area, such that you can effectively communicate it to others. You can teach it to others. Whereas if you just come to certain truths concretely through the course of your own experience, you can't really teach others. If somebody asks you, you might say, oh, well, I got here because I tried this and I tried that. That might help someone get started, but it's not actually teaching them, right? So does this make sense so far? Any questions about this? So does it make sense what techne means and how art in English is translated here from techne? Okay. So Ion wants to know why he's able to speak so well about Homer and his poetry, but when it comes to any other poet, he falls asleep, he says. He has nothing else to say. So on page 53, this is where Socrates answers that Ion speaks of Homer, quote, without art or knowledge. Now, as I just said, art means techne, a kind of productive knowledge by which some effect can be brought about. Okay. Now, since every techne is a kind of knowledge where some universal rule or principle, that is a rule or principle that has a wide degree of applicability, is applied to some particular instance or instances, it follows that Ion's ability to only perform Homeric poetry well and not any other kind of poetry, that shows that it can't be in virtue of his possession of the techne of poetry or the poetic arts. Because The effect of techne is such that if it works on application to one particular matter of our concrete experience, then it should also work when applied to anything reasonably connected, that is reasonably a part of the entire conceptual milieu with which we're dealing, right? Yet that's not the case. He's effective as a performer or interpreter of poetry when it comes to this particular poet, but not when it comes to poetry more broadly, which means he doesn't have the kind of systematic technical knowledge that would enable him to perform and speak well when it comes to a variety of other poetic sources. Okay. So does that make sense? Are any questions about that? Well, on 53 and 54, Socrates anticipates later divisions in the so-called fine arts, and we'll turn to Hegel, who makes the first formal definition to distinguish the so-called fine arts from things like medicine or athletics or house building, carpentry, and so forth. So it's really Hegel who in the modern world discriminates what we call the so-called fine arts, such as poetry, literature, painting, sculpture, dance, and so forth, from these other entities, which nevertheless result in their being from technical knowledge. And so he says, he mentions painting, he mentions sculpture, he mentions music, and he says that they're all poetic. And this suggests that poetry is the, so with a capital THE, is the original and paradigmatic art form. So every one of the arts, and further, every one of the fine arts, is essentially poetic, in the sense that poiesis, this is what I mention and clarify in the yellow here, poiesis means production, or even more literally than that, bringing forth. So sometimes in the text in our reading, Plato will use that precise verbiage. So bring forth, bringing something forth. And specifically, we mean something brought forth into presence, showing itself, manifest, that was in a prior way absent, concealed, or non-existent. So poiesis, and you can think about this in the sense, and we'll find this in the case of Aristotle, that nature is essentially poetic. So think about how through what scientists call dehiscence, which is where some interiority bursts forth, showing itself on the outside. And that's what goes on with a seed, for example. The seed of, say, a flower or a tree or some other plant. It's embedded in the earth and it somehow bursts forth from an obscure interior, which is unavailable for our perceptual awareness. And then it bursts forth still from the earth and presents itself. There was previously nothing there, but now you've got this flower unfolding. So you can see poiesis in real time, by the way, if you go to YouTube and you look up time-lapse photography of like flowers or plants, you can see this whole process unfold. And that's really how the Greeks understood poiesis, the very basis of poetry, as paradigmatic of all production, all bringing forth. So just like nature brings forth the blossom of a rose where there wasn't one before, the poet brings forth in linguistic sounds, that is intelligible, meaningful sounds, an idea or an image that was previously non-existent or obscure or absent. Okay, so does this make sense? And so here's where we get to the heart of the ion. So Socrates says, the gift which you possess of speaking excellently about Homer is not an art, it's not a techne, but an inspiration. He says, there is a divinity moving you, like that contained in the stone, which Euripides calls a magnet. The stone not only attracts iron rings, but also imparts to them a similar power of attracting other rings. And sometimes you may see a number of pieces of iron and rings suspended from one another, so as to form quite a long chain. And all of them derive their power of suspension from the original stone. In like manner, the muse, first of all, inspires men herself, and from these inspired persons, a chain of other persons is suspended who take the inspiration. For all good poets compose their beautiful poems not by art or techne, but because they are inspired and possessed. So what is Socrates arguing here by means of this image, this analogy of magnetism and iron? Anyone have thoughts about those?
I sort of see it in the context of how we were just talking about forms, the stone representing like this ideal perfect form and inspiration, and then artists coming along and creating interpretations of it as sort of physical manifestations of this perfect form, which then inspire more artists, and they tack on the rings, or however you want to conceptualize the image that Socrates or Plato creates.
Good, yeah. So referencing the forms here is meaningful in the sense that we are dealing with a kind of causal order of contingency, such that, like the particular example of, say, the beautiful, so a beautiful flower is causally contingent on or dependent on the form of beauty. In this case, the power of one ring of iron to attract subsequent rings of iron is contingent or dependent upon its originary relation to the first magnet in the series, which imparts that power down this ongoing chain. So yeah, I think that makes sense, the way you connected those aspects of Plato's thinking here. Just checking the chat. Sophia said, puts value in that way in the artist's vision, more than or at least in the scale of creation, to create from the soul, not from the perceived likability of the masses. Yeah, that's interesting. Did you want to say more about that, Fia?
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting, his like just his perspective really, like I mentioned, put value in the artist, but also highlighted that it doesn't necessarily give them some inherent ability to understand or perceive the inspirations of other artists. And I think as an artist, it's kind of very telling of the personality of, like, I'm interested in this and nothing else, and like that's just kind of how it is. So I thought it was interesting to comment on that. Was it like a different spin-off of, I think, what he was trying to say, but from like the perspective of creation, not to put the emphasis in like so much what other people are thinking or interpreting about your art, kind of similar to the first photograph we were looking at with the crucifix. It wasn't necessarily his, and I mean, it probably was to an extent, but like his other people's interpretations didn't really like change how he wanted to create that piece, I guess is what I was trying to say.
Yeah, so Serrano had to recognize the limitations in terms of taboo discourse, or at least what is possibly to be successful under current art world conditions when he was making his piece. But there are also sources of inspiration beyond that, such that he could say, I'm gripped by this particular vision, to put forth, or through poiesis to bring forth some idea, to use Socrates' language, drawing from Diotima in the Symposium, of a pregnancy of the soul. And then others could maybe react critically to the production. And they might be gripped in a different way by the now magnetized object. In fact, they could be, as a magnet in their own right, repelled by it, right? As we've seen in today's discussion. So yeah, that's interesting. Okay. So yeah, we'll build on this. But yeah, those are some really good thoughts and comments you guys are raising here. So the muses are mentioned, right? But what are these muses? I'm sure you guys have heard of the muse before, the very idea of a muse. But in Greek mythology, these muses are the goddesses of poetic inspiration. And they are, as such, the offspring of Zeus and Mnemosyne, who is the goddess of memory, right? And so that's interesting as well, just to think of the production of that marriage or relationship. And so how should we think of these muses? Well, they're like a bridge by which mortals are able to commerce with the divine, but only indirectly. And so we're dealing with two entirely incommensurable domains: the domain of the finite and profane, which is the world that we come to occupy and know, and the domain of the divine. And so the muses serve as a kind of bridge for relating across that rigid line of difference. And so as such, it's only possible for indirect communication. Now, according to Socrates, then, poets are mortals who are literally possessed. That is to say, they're taken over by these deities, these muses. And so the work that poets engage in, that is the practice of writing poems, painting, sculpting, composing, etc., is really the work of interpreting the inspiration. So I am inspired by some muse, and in my effort to render intelligible, to articulate the real heart of that inspiration, I have to make an interpretation. And through that interpretive process, which is also a productive or creative process, the work that I will generate, that I am aiming in my reflective vision to create, is brought about. And so coming from the domain of divinities, incomprehensible to human minds, the source of this inspiration is always strange and overwhelming. And so to follow Socrates' metaphor, who are these muses? Well, they are the original stones, the original magnets, which give their power of attraction to the poets. So Homer was first of all gripped in his own life by a kind of musical, to use that adjective in this particular context, vision. And that required interpretation. And out of that interpretive act, we find the epic poems. So the Iliad and the Odyssey. And then a rhapsode, so a theatrical performer, an actor, like Ion in this case, is for his part attracted to the vision of Homer, who was first attracted by this musical vision, the images communicated from the realm of the divine by the muses through the bridging kind of membrane, you might say, that the muses in effect bring about. And so then the poets impart these powers to the rhapsodes, such as Ion, as he, in a public way, performs the poetry. And then Ion, as a rhapsode, attracts ordinary lovers of poetry, those who would be in the public square witnessing the theatrical demonstration. They become attracted to the vision presented or communicated or manifested in practice of Ion or the rhapsode, and it forms this very long chain. And then you, as a lover of poetry, might tell your friend, hey, have you read this? It's great. And you are, in that way, as a champion, so to speak, of the arts, or an appreciator of the arts at least, are extending the scope of power here by attracting others to the originary vision, which is now communicated in really powerfully different ways through these chains of connection. And so here are the important upshots of this. And so next we'll talk about the symposium with just the little bit of time we have left, and then we'll have to continue that conversation. And we'll continue that conversation at the beginning of class Thursday before giving space to group 1, who will make some comments about this maybe, but also walk us through the reading assigned for Thursday from the Laws and the Sophist, so other Platonic dialogues. So here are some important takeaways. Poets or creative artists in general, insofar as all of these so-called fine arts are essentially poetic in the sense of poiesis, bringing forth what was absent. They are out of their minds. So the emotions we experience when we experience a work of art are real and powerful, but they seem to come to us from the outside. And in this way, we are ecstatic in our experience of such emotions. Ecstasis means literally, although it's as a more or less ordinary word, tossed around with the sense of extreme joy, right? When you're ecstatic, you are kind of overwhelmed with happiness, but it literally means standing out. Static, as in outside, and then static coming from stasis or standing. So in our experience as producers or consumers of art, in this kind of musical possession, we find ourselves ecstatic. We are somehow outside of ourselves. And this makes a lot of sense if you think about theatrical interpretations or what actors are doing in films. So to really bring to presence a character in a movie, the actor has to embody that character. And for that reason, in the course of the embodiment, has to really experience in order to effectively exemplify the emotional states that are importantly at play. So the actor will feel emotions that are not quite everyday emotions because they're not the actors. The actor is trying to experience the emotional state of someone who doesn't even exist. And for that reason, they are literally, in the sense, pushed out of themselves in order to make room for the presence to whom they're giving expression in the performance. And so this means, and this is an important upshot, that at the very earliest moments of our intellectual history, the very earliest moments of aesthetic discourse, that is thinking about art is seen to serve a relational function because art takes us out of ourselves and makes us confront difference in an important sense. So does that make sense? And so there's something absurd about experiencing art. If you go to a play, you might be brought to tears. And so Socrates mentions this. There's like, you would be seen as crazy. You're just standing there. You seem to be fine. There's nothing wrong, but you're crying. Well, why are you crying? Because of something happened to individuals who are presented aesthetically, but which don't even exist, right? So we feel experiences which are not properly our own. So we are in that way occupied. We are possessed by something profoundly and radically other. In this respect, difference. And then in the Ion, Plato paves the way for this distinction that continues to operate in various ways that we'll see again and again. And I mentioned this at the beginning today. So first of all, there's art as technical, where creative production is governed by rules and principles, such that you could be said to be an artistic expert in the relevant area, whether that's sculpture, painting, poetry, or whatever. Versus art as, let's say, poetic, where all aesthetic rules and principles are subordinated. They're made secondary to a creative inspiration, such that we see in Ion, that is excessive, overwhelming, surprising, and for this reason too, potentially threatening, and might actually threaten to undermine the social order of a political community, which means that art is powerful in not only a positive, transformative way, but also in a dangerous way. Okay. All right, so we're out of time, but we'll turn immediately before getting into, I was just visited by my cat here. We'll turn immediately next time to the symposium before getting into the sophist and the laws. So we'll have to spend maybe 30 or 40 minutes on the symposium. And I think in many ways it's much more interesting than the Ion. So hopefully you guys have some comments or questions about that and the reading assigned for Thursday. So the dialogues, the sophist, and the laws that we'll be talking about, quite a bit different and in many ways much more inaccessible or difficult than the Ion and the Symposium. So that's why I had you read Ion and Symposium first, even though they come later in the textbook, just so you weren't immediately put off this week. And so, yeah, we'll end it there, but if you have questions about the group presentation assignment, let me know, just send me an email. And if you haven't joined a group, please do so as quickly as you can. And that's it. Are there any final comments or questions? All right, guys. Well, I hope you enjoyed this discussion of Plato, and we'll keep it going on Thursday. So thanks for your presence, and I will see you Thursday. So let me know if there are any questions in the meantime.
Thank you.
All right, have a good one.